right, my guest today on the Cale Clark Show is somebody who I've wanted to meet for a very, very long time. He's a brilliant author. His writings are read by over 1 million people every week with his twice weekly newsletter, The Curiosity Chronicle. He's coming out with a brand new book, The 5 Types of Wealth. We've got lots to talk about. My guest today is Sahil Bloom. Sahil, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a stellar intro, by the way. I do a lot of these. I feel like that was like an A+ intro. You nailed that.
Thank you. I try to be professional as much as possible. Well, let me ask you this question. When I first heard about this book that you're coming out with, The 5 Types of Wealth, immediately when you see a book with wealth in the title, you're going to think this is about money. And it is a little bit, of course. That's one of the pillars. But that is not the most important thing by any stretch of the imagination. Tell me about what happened to you a few years ago that made you realize that you had to make a change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is probably something that a lot of people can resonate with, which is just the fact that the cultural default setting is to measure your life on the basis of financial terms.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is because money is so easily measured. Peter Drucker, the management theorist, has this quote, "What gets measured gets managed." And the whole idea is that like the thing that is easily measured ends up being the thing that we optimize around. It ends up being the thing that we focus all of our energy around. And money, because it's so simple, because it's just a number, has become this cultural default form of measurement. It's the way that we stack ourselves up. It's the way that we compare ourselves to others. And the challenge with that and the issue with that is your wealthy life may involve money, but it's going to be defined by so much around it, by so many other things. And in my own life, what I found, and I'll share the personal experience with this, is that my incessant quest, my incessant chase for more financially was tearing the rest of my life apart. And what I found was that as I was continuing to rise and continuing to make more and more money, and from the outside looking in, being more and more successful, everything else was slowly crumbling, was slowly chipping and falling apart. There's this old fable of a philosopher named Thales of Miletus who's walking along and is looking up and staring at the stars and falls into a well that he doesn't see at his feet. And it's this whole idea that you're chasing this like castle that's in the air, but you lose sight of the thing that's right in front of you. And I really felt like that was a good analogy for the life that I was living. I was chasing this external definition of success that frankly was just not aligned with what my values were, the things that were really important to me. And I needed a reset. All of this came to a head in May of 2021. I had leading up to that, been on this very stable, steady, traditional track towards a successful life, making more and more money each year, working in the world of finance. And from the outside looking in, you would have said I was winning the game. But internally, I started to feel like if that was what winning the game looked like, I might have been playing the wrong game. And I was living 3,000 miles away from my family. We were on the West Coast. My parents, my wife's parents were all on the East Coast. And at the time, my wife and I were trying to conceive and struggling to do so. And I don't know if there are any listeners out there that have dealt with that, but it's something that becomes a real burden, especially for the woman.
We dealt with it too, by the way.
Yeah. And it's something that people don't talk about. It's stigmatized, and people try to kind of bear the burden themselves, and you remain silent about it. And one of the challenging things when you remain silent about challenges you're facing is that they become heavier and heavier when you're just trying to hold them yourself. And unfortunately, it was a burden that my wife felt was hers. And because of where I was in life and my own insecurities and my own challenges with what I was facing on my journey, I did not do a good job of helping to bear that burden with her. In May of 2021, I got together with an old friend who asked how I was doing. And initially I just said, "Oh, I'm good, busy," right? Like the standard response when you get together with someone, they ask how you're doing. And he kind of looked at me and looked right through me. And so then I said, it's tough being so far away from my parents, from my wife's parents, living on the West Coast. my parents and I have been really close our whole life, and being that far from them was challenging. And he just said, well, how often do you see them? I said, once a year. He said, how old are they? I said, mid-60s. And he looked at me and he just said, okay, so you're going to see them 15 more times before they die. And I remember feeling like I had just gotten punched in the gut. The idea that the amount of time you have left with the people you care about most in the world is so finite that you can count it on a few hands is just terrifying. It's not math that you ever do, but it's the math that you actually do need to do. And in that moment, it was the thing that I needed to hear to make a change in my life. And I woke up the next morning and I told my wife that I thought we did need to make that change. And within 45 days, I had left my job. We had sold our house in California and moved back to the East Coast to be closer to our family. And the entire journey really came full circle because within 2 weeks of getting back home, my wife got pregnant.
Incredible.
And it's just a reminder, I think, that when your life and energy come into alignment, everything sort of falls into place as it should.
And you've written about, coming home from the hospital and seeing both sets of parents there to welcome you guys home. What was that moment like?
It still gives me chills. To this day, I feel like there has been no single change that has had a greater positive impact on our life and on our happiness than moving across the country to live closer to all of them. That feeling of really being at home is something that's hard to describe. It's hard to put into words. And I felt like when I wrote that in the beginning of the book, I felt like that captured it, that feeling that you're being welcomed home by your people. And that home can be anything. For us, it was geographic. It was being close to our families. That home can be the community of loved ones anywhere. That can be your church. That could be your spiritual group. It could be your prayer group. It could be that friend group. Whatever it is, that feeling of belonging is so important to the human condition. And yet, it's not something that we measure as a form of wealth. It's not something that we think about as being wealth. But at the end of the day, it is dramatically more important than money to our overall happiness, to our contentment, to our fulfillment, and to what we actually think about when we're in the later years of our life. And so that at its core is really what I'm wanting people to think about, wanting people to ask those questions about what wealth really means to you and how do you build your life around those things that truly matter.
Yeah. And talking about your family, your wife Elizabeth, she figures prominently in a really great section of the book where you open up a letter that you wrote to yourself in 2014 when you graduated university. And when I read that section, I was shocked, but I'm sure not as shocked as you were how prescient that thing really was. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so in 2014, it was New Year's 2014, right when I was about to graduate college, I wrote a letter to my future self. This was something that I had read about probably like in high school, the idea of like write a letter to your future self, set your intentions for what the future looked like. And I had done it a few times in the past, but only like a 1-year future or 3-year future. And usually I was doing that because I wanted to get the dopamine from opening it. So I was like, let me set the time that I'm sending it to close enough that I can kind of feel it and make it worth it. But that year was a little different. All right, I was finishing school and I always had this feeling that like, okay, people are telling you to make these 10-year plans for your life. Like, where are you going to be in 10 years? So I sat down and, I was probably in a little bit of like a New Year's haze the night after probably what was a big party, if I recall correctly. And I wrote that letter. And to be totally frank, I completely forgot that I had written it and stored it. And I only found it when we were handling some documents after my son was born. So we were dealing with a will and a few different documents. And I found it in the safe where we keep that stuff. And I found it like, within 3 weeks of when I was going to have to open it to start the year in 2024, 10 years later. And it came literally within like 2 or 3 weeks of when I was having to turn in the final draft of this book. And I opened the letter and read it. And as you see in the book, it was mind-blowing. It was an important lesson for one specific reason, which was that what it told me and what it showed me was that I had known the answers all along. I had known the things that mattered to me. I knew the values. I knew those things that were going to drive that lasting happiness and contentment and fulfillment. I just hadn't asked the question yet. And that became a theme for the whole book. And so it was so powerful because it literally the book was done. The book was completed. And then I opened that letter and I sent an email to my editor and I said, I need more time because this has to be in the book. It was so powerful. I was like, this changes and the texture of it, the idea that we all have the answers. Yeah. You know what the answers are. You just haven't asked the right questions yet.
Yeah, and it's so true. And you quote Steve Jobs in the book as well, the famous commencement address at your alma mater at Stanford University, where you played baseball, by the way. And he said this in 2005. He said, your time is limited. Don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most importantly, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you want to become. Stay hungry, stay foolish. This idea, I mean, that's exactly what happened to you. You kind of already knew what was inside and in this letter to your future self who you wanted to be. And so I think it's a good kind of segue to talk about time wealth, which is I thought really an incredibly powerful part of the book and the story that you just told about wanting to be with your parents, your wife's parents, as much as you possibly can in the time that you have left. There's another book that I think both of us are probably pretty fond of, 4,000 Weeks, which is incredible, by Oliver Burkeman. You allude to that. We have this fixed period of time. You know, most people live, give or take, 80 years. That's just over 4,000 weeks. And we have to make sure that we spend those weeks well. And you've got some ideas about how to do that.
Yeah, this idea is one that is so universal and so important for people to internalize. I mean, time as your most precious asset, as the only asset that really matters, is critical because it's what allows you to live in the way that you want to live. That realization that your time is finite, that it's impermanent, that you can't just wait for the laters, right? Yeah. All of us, especially ambitious people, your life is filled with these laters. Oh, I'll spend more time with my kids later. I'll work on my health later. I'll enjoy my work later. And the reality is that later is just another word for never. Yeah. Because by the time you are ready to do that thing, they are not available in the same way they are today. Your kids will not be 10 years old later. Yeah. You will not have the same health later. Yeah. You will not be able to build a life of freedom and enjoyment later. Things change. And so if you're not going to do it now, if you're not going to design it into your life now, you may as well come to terms with the fact that you're never going to do it. And, you know, I recently had an experience that really brought this to the fore for me. My grandmother, who I also write about in the book, passed away about a year ago. And she was incredible. Just a force of a woman, you know, and I think in a different life and in a different context, she would have been famous, like some incredible storyteller.
Wasn't she a princess? Like...
She was born a princess in India prior to kind of British occupation and the colonial rule. But she was unbelievable, the best storyteller, such a vibrant personality. And when she passed away, we all got together to mourn her loss. And we stood in a circle in my parents' garden and we told stories about her life, the things we remembered about her, all of these things. And it was beautiful, more of a celebration of life than a mourning of her loss. But I was struck by one thing. I was looking at the card that we had for the event, and it had her name, and then it had her birthday and her date of death with that little dash in between. And I was reflecting on this recently, that your entire life is captured in this dash. Yeah. This tiny little line that captures everything. Your hopes, your fears, your successes, failures, struggles, heartbreaks, seasons of love, seasons of loss, all of it in this tiny little line that captures your whole life. And you have a chance to write that line every single day. So how are you going to write it? What are you going to do with your one crazy tiny little dash? Yeah. That call to arms, I just think I think that is the most powerful thing that you can take away from this book. It's like, there is no such thing as later. It is now.
Yeah, absolutely. And you quote also a fun 2004 movie, Troy and Achilles. And I know you're obviously pretty fond of Greek mythology, but this is a great quote that where Achilles says something like, the gods are jealous of us. Everything is more beautiful because we are doomed. Like the drama of life. We are going to die. Our time will run out, or 4,000 weeks, or maybe less. We never know. And it's very much a treasure. It's a saint that I admire, Saint Jose Maria Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei, he used to talk about time being like kind of like withdrawing gold coins out of the treasure box every day. Every day is like a gold coin. We just don't know when you're going to pull the last one. But that is the drama of life, and there's been so much talk in recent months about, are guys too into the Roman Empire? And the answer is yes, and there's nothing wrong with that.
My son is named Roman, so
yeah, exactly.
I'm clearly too into the Roman Empire.
Yeah. Well, talk to me about what you learned about the victory ceremonies for Roman heroes.
Yeah, I mean, this relates to this exact concept. So in ancient Rome, they would have these elaborate military parades after these victories, and they would the conquering hero would be literally paraded through the streets on this golden chariot, and the throngs of people would come out to celebrate them. And they did something interesting during these parades. They would put someone in the chariot with the hero right behind them, who throughout the entire parade, with these throngs of adoring fans lathering praise on them, would just whisper in their ear this phrase, memento mori. And it means, remember thou art mortal. Remember that you will die. And it was important. And it is important as a reminder for all of us, because it's this idea that no matter how much praise people are lavishing on you, no matter how easy it is to start to feel immortal in your youth or during your early years of life, you will die. It is the one certainty that we are all going to face, no matter what you do, no matter all of the things. And it could be today. It could be hopefully 70 years from now, maybe 100 years from now, if all of this technology takes off in the way people seem to think it will. But you will. And knowing that is not morbid. It's not dark. It's a call to arms. It's a form of love for yourself to recognize that. Because what it means is that there is urgency. What it means is that, again, later does not exist. Your child will not be 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old later. Actually doing those things now, pulling all of those actions into the present, is what matters in the end. And, I share this in the book, but there are these windows of time that have added importance. That is just a fact of life. There's this idea in ancient Greek culture you allude to, two types of time. There's chronos, which is the chronological time, normal, and then there's kairos, which is this idea that some moments have greater importance. It's kind of a qualitative form of time. And that is true for our lives. There are windows when someone occupies your life that are so important. I mean, they say that like 95% of the time you have with your parents happens before you're age 18. And then after that, you get only this tiny amount of time with your parents left. And, if there's one thing I learned, it's that you can create time with your actions. And, like for our own move back to the East Coast, we made a change. I learned that fact 15 more times before my parents were gone, and we made a change. Now that number went from 15 to hundreds. I see my parents every other week now. So we went from 15 times before they die to hundreds by making a change, by taking an action. That is literally time created. It is time created with the people that you care about most. So the idea that time is just fixed, maybe, but the way that you use it to create moments, the things that matter most to you, is not fixed. You can change that. You can bend it. You can mold it.
Yeah. That's a big theme in the book as well when you talk about time wealth. We know Father Time is undefeated. Guys like Tom Brady give him a run for his money, with TB12 method and all that stuff. I don't know if you tried it, but...
Just don't eat tomatoes. That's what he says, right?
Avocado toast is awesome, though.
I grew up a Patriots fan in Boston, so I love Tom Brady.
You gotta love TB12. But I mean, one of the things that we can do, though, is I think we can certainly win a few rounds with Father Time if we lose the battle ultimately, which we will. And you do talk about ways that you can actually kind of manipulate time by breaking the relationship between inputs and outputs in your life. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So the idea is that most of your life and most of what you're taught is that you take an input and it creates an output. And there's this kind of fixed relationship with time that you learn, and that kind of gets cemented in your mind. This idea that you do one thing and it creates another thing. And everyone generally exists in this one-to-one fixed loop. So if I want to make more money, if I want to take on more professionally, what it means is I have to put more time into the thing to get more out of it. And the challenge with that is we grind ourselves into the ground. And I think a lot of listeners can appreciate this. You get more and more busy. It's unclear if you're actually making real progress. And if you want to make more, you have to just continue doing more. the whole idea that I try to get across is that there are actually actions you can take where you can break that fixed loop, where you can deploy 1 unit of energy and actually generate 2 units of output or 5 units of output or 10 units of output. And that comes from focusing on the right things. We all know intrinsically that there are a few things in our lives that really matter. And whether it's professionally or personally, there's kind of a couple of things that are actions you can take that really drive the ball forward. But we spend a lot of time on the things that don't, right? Like, so I'll give you an example from my life. I spend a lot of time emailing. Not really a great use of time.
No.
The things that are highest leverage in my life are creative. They're writing, because I can write one newsletter and have it reach 10,000 people a few years ago. Now it reaches 1 million people. But that's just through writing. And that's reaching more and more people. That's creating more and more impact, which is my measure of success. There are things like that if you spend more time on them, you're going to generate those asymmetric, those outsized outcomes. But you're constantly wasting your time on those fixed loops. You don't have time to deploy into those asymmetric things. And so figuring out, identifying those things that are the real needle movers in your life, professionally and also personally, is the thing that matters. And personally is an important point there, by the way, because it's easy to concern yourself with the saying yes to everything, right? You're like, I have to say yes to every single friend, every single event, everything I get invited to, when really there are just a few things that you're missing out on by doing that. And it might be the present moments with your child or with your partner. It might be those couple of friends that you're neglecting because you're saying yes to everything. And in the end, the depth is much more important than the breadth in the long run.
Absolutely. I'm with Sahil Bloom. You're listening to The Cale Clark Show or watching on YouTube. We're talking about his new book, The 5 Types of Wealth. Yeah, I think that's a really important point to bring up, actually, this whole concept of no. Because every time you say yes to something, something that you really don't want to do, it's not a good use of your time. You're saying no to the things that matter. What's a great framework for people to start saying no more?
Yeah, there's a few. I would say professionally, the one that I really like is when you are going to say yes to something, just pause for a second and think about whether you would do this tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because what we often do is we create this time warp in our mind. So like someone invites you to do something a month from now and you say yes. When in reality, if it were tomorrow, you might have a completely different response. Or if it were tonight, you might have a completely different response because you have things going on. There's something called the yes damn effect that I write about in the book, which is found in scientific research, that people have a distorted view on time. We assume that we will have more time a month from now than we have right now. If you're really busy right now, but a month from now, you're like, well, this project's going to get done and I'll have more free time in a month, so let me say yes to this. If you are going to say yes to something on the basis of having more time later, you should just say no to it because you never actually have more time. You find things to fill it. The other one is a way of fighting our natural optimism. Usually when you have a new project or opportunity, you assume it is going to go completely according to plan, both from a time perspective and from a kind of like profit or outcome perspective. Yeah. What I often find useful is to say, okay, if this is going to take twice as long as I initially think and be half as beneficial or profitable, would I still want to do it? And because that immediately cuts into that natural optimism that you have. Like I find when I take on something new, I'm like massively, I get excited about things, right? Like I get over optimistic and excited. And so that can lead you into saying yes to something that you otherwise might be on the edge about if it didn't quite go so well. And so that to me is like a helpful way to just like shave back that optimism and view things with a more balanced perspective.
Yeah, I really like that. And this idea that, as Derek Sivers says, it's not a heck yes, it's a no. It's got to be that. So,
yes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And so we talked about time. There are different types of wealth you talked about in the book as well. And the second one is social wealth, because we are, of course, social animals. There's no question about that. And you talk about the work of, really it's the longest running, I think maybe, I don't know if it's the longest running, but it's one of the longest running longitudinal studies that are out there, where your dad taught at Harvard the study of adult development and human happiness. Dr. Robert Waldinger, who's the current director of the project. And he talks about how the single greatest predictor of physical health at age 80 was the quality of our relationships at age 50. And that is absolutely huge. You talk about human connection, and you talk about an anthropologist, Margaret Mead, who talks about the healed femur as being a great marker in human history. Talk about that.
Yeah, it's such an interesting story. So Margaret Mead's famous anthropologist, and was asked by a group of students what the first indication was of human civilized society. And they thought she was going to say something about the use of tools or something like that, money, whatever, something like that. And what she said was a healed, broken femur. And the reason she answered that is because, for those who don't know, the femur is a really long bone in your leg. It is also notoriously long to recover from a broken one. It takes about 9 months to fully recover. And so her rationale was that pre-civilized society, a broken femur was a death sentence because you would be left behind. You were a burden on the group. You would be left behind to die in the wild. And that the first signs of a healed broken femur indicated that you had been cared for, that the group put you before the interests of the entire group and actually found value in your life, in you being alive. And they took care of you for this long period of recovery while you clearly were unable to do things physically. That was what she thought was the first sign. And what it implies is that our human connection, that feeling of togetherness, that feeling of support for one another, is something that actually enabled us and made us uniquely human. We are a uniquely social species in a sense.
Okay, you're watching The Cale Clark Show. I'm with Sahil Bloom, the author of The 5 Types of Wealth, available wherever fine books are sold from Penguin Random House. And speaking of the house, the Random House, we don't want to be random in the way that we have these relationships in the house. That may be a corny segue, but you mentioned something in the book that really kind of spoke to me. You talked about the tension between being present at home with the ones we love, spending time with them, and also having the people that you love, your kids, your spouse, look up to you for what you're accomplishing, for the work that you're doing, for the impact that you're making, because they're going to remember that as well for the rest of their lives. And talk about the interplay between those two tensions of making sure that you're present, but yet accomplishing your unique mission in life.
This goes back to something we briefly spoke about earlier, of these moments, these windows of time that are so important. And I have a 2.5-year-old son, so I'm in one of those moments right now, which is just this idea that there is a 10-year window during which you are your child's favorite person in the world. After that, they have other favorite people. They have friends, best friends, girlfriends, boyfriends, partners of their own, children of their own, and you never occupy that role. But during that 10 years, you are literally everything to them. Now, that 10 years also happens to coincide with the moment in time in your life when you happen to be chasing the things professionally. It happens to be the moment of peak ambition when you are accelerating in your career, when you're doing things. That tension is, I would argue, the most challenging tension during this stage of life. It's balancing those desires, those feelings of wanting to do more, of taking on more things professionally, with the need to be present and drive your energy into that relationship. Now, for me, I have come to terms with this on the idea of work-life harmony rather than balance. Everyone talks about this idea of balance. And there was this meme that sort of went viral of the only people that will remember you working late 20 years from now are your children. And that was a call to action to say, don't work late. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because I also very strongly believe that you cannot teach your children anything. You have to embody the things that you want them to learn. One of the things that is very important for your children to learn is that working hard on things that you care about is the way that you create the outcomes you want in life. I learned that from my father. I didn't learn that because he sat me down and said, hey, son, you have to work hard on the things you care about to create the outcomes you want. I saw him doing that. Every single day, I would see him work hard, come home, sit down and have dinner with the family. He was exhausted at the end of a long day. If I asked him to play catch, he was going outside and playing catch with me. He would put me to bed. What was he doing after I went to bed? He was working. And I would see him doing that. I would see him going into his office late at night to work. But he had taken the time, he had carved out the time to be there, to be present with me, and then he was going to do what was necessary. He was going to do what he needed to do to work on the things he cared about. And the important point here is that you need to include your children, you need to include your partner, whoever it is in your life, in the why. of all of this. Because children especially, if they aren't filled in on the why, they fill it with the worst version. They fill it with, Dad's not around because he doesn't like me. Dad's not around because he doesn't care about me. When that's not the case at all. Dad's not around because he wants to provide, because he believes in building a life that will last beyond him, taking care of the people in his family. And letting them know that, including them on that journey, that is where that harmony is found, in my opinion. And so I try to get that idea across, because it's so easy to feel this guilt of, oh, I'm not around a lot right now because I'm really working on this big project, or I'm pushing this big thing forward. Me right now, I'm traveling a lot. I'm not around as much as I would like to be because I'm doing this. But my son is going to know why I'm doing that. He might be a little too young to understand it, but he's going to see it and he's going to feel it. And when he reads the book, he's going to see it in the words and in how important him and his mom are to me and to this life.
I love how you talked about, Sahil, the idea of involving them in the why. And sometimes even you can actually get them physically involved. You talked about the plane ride you took with your dad.
Yeah. I was really fortunate when I was young that I was able to do some traveling with my dad to some of his work trips. And this is something that I want to do with my son as he gets older, because I remember how formative it was. You know, my dad's an academic. He's a researcher, professor, and he would occasionally go to give these talks. And this one trip, I got to go with him as his plus one. And I must have been 8 years old.
Yeah.
And because
Where was it?
It was to Asia. So it was a long trip.
Man.
And because I was his plus one, they had like given him, they'd paid for him to fly business class. And so it was like my dad and me, in this nice plane flying to Asia. And I was sitting business class, first time in my life that I'd ever gotten to do something like that. There's the TV, there's all the meals. And so I'm sitting there like, a kid in a candy store, literally watching movies the whole time, doing all this stuff. Yeah. And I just remember my dad sitting next to me the entire flight. TV was off, on his laptop, doing his presentation, working on things, preparing. And when we were landing, I said to him, I was like, Dad, you didn't watch a single movie on that whole flight.
What? Watched the whole Star Wars trilogy.
You didn't watch a single movie. You didn't have a meal. And he just said, that is what it takes. That's what's required for me to perform at the level that I'm capable of at this event. And the message was that that's why we're that's why we're here. This is what's required. I'm going to do what I said I was going to do, which is going to show up and deliver. Someone is paying for us to come on this trip and to do this thing, and I'm going to show up and deliver to the best of my ability for those people. And that stuck with me. Yeah. I mean, anytime I've been put into a situation where I needed to work hard on something, I remember that. And it's not that he taught me something about it. It's that I saw him. It's that I actually had to be immersed in it. I was included in the why. I was on the journey.
Yeah, I love that. It was definitely more caught than taught. There's no question about that. And that's such a powerful lesson. And this is how kids learn, through example. And they also have great BS detectors too. Like they can tell when you're not a person of integrity and when you're not living your values outright. And they can kind of smell it. So I just love that. I love that, absolutely. So clearly too, as well, you've got the relationship with your son Roman, but really the heart of your family is your relationship with your wife Elizabeth. And you do give a lot of great relationship advice, specifically marriage advice, in the book as well. I want to talk to you a little bit about what you call the 3 levels of listening, because obviously communication is key in any personal relationship, especially in marriage. Talk about those levels of listening and how have you used those with Elizabeth?
Yeah. This is a really important framework for life, and it applies to romantic relationships for sure, but also to your broader interactions and building deep relationships with others. This is the idea that there are 3 types of listening. So the first level is me listening. What does that mean? It's sort of a form of conversational narcissism, which is we're having a conversation, and the entire time you're talking, I'm just thinking about how everything you say relates to me. Yeah. You're talking about your life, your interests, your things, and in my mind, I'm running off on a train of like, oh yeah, well I'm interested in that.
Too,
I have soccer. Soccer. Like I'm interested in soccer. I wonder how Messi was doing in that game. Like, oh, that was an interesting ending. What? I'm just thinking about my own life. That's the first level, and we spend 80% of our lives in that level of listening. The second level is you listening, which is you are speaking and I am truly immersed in what you are saying. I'm thinking about how it relates to you, how it's building a pattern for who you are as an individual, your interests, your passions, your fears, all of these things about you. The third level is us listening, which is taking that information that I'm learning about you and creating a map of the world, how it relates to all of the people around us, how it relates to how you interact with your communities and the people around you. It's sort of the highest level of listening. And the idea there in that framework is to be more aware when you are in that level 1 of me listening. Recognize it. So if you're having a conversation with someone, you're trying to be present with them, whether it's your partner or a new friend or someone you're trying to get to know, catch yourself when you find your train of thought wandering, when you're just connecting everything to yourself, and recenter. Try to come back to that level 2 or level 3 when you default into the level 1. Just shift yourself a little bit, because shifting from 80% level 1 to 60% is a big, big impact on your life and on those relationships.
Yeah, you can make a big shift with just a little tweak. I love that.
We've referenced this throughout the conversation, but the whole intention with the book and with the structure of how it's formed is there's a section for each of the types of wealth. And at the end of each section, there's a guide. And the guide is intended to provide the actual high leverage systems for building that type of wealth in your life. So rather than just being a theory book of, okay, here's what's important and here's how to build your life around it, actually, here's what to go do. Here's the things, the actions you can take today, this week, to start making progress on these other areas.
Yeah, I love how practical you made it. It's great. And you talk, getting back to romantic relationships for a little bit, you talk about 2 rules in particular about romantic relationships. What are they?
2 rules. I'm forgetting now.
That was the understanding the love languages and avoiding the traps.
Oh, yes. Yes. So the 2 rules. The first one is, I would say, it's sort of like the upside and then avoiding the downside, if you will. So the first one is just around love languages. I don't know how familiar you are with this, Chapman's sort of whole theory.
It's funny. My sister, when I was younger, she said, you really should read these books about women. One of them was, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and then there was this one as well. So and I do think it's right on. And I know what my wife's love languages are.
And this is this idea that we all have our own love language. The concept of the sort of the one way that we experience and feel love, or at least the highest way that we experience and feel it. And something I learned, and it probably took me way too long to learn, was what my wife's love language was. And we've been dating a long time before we got married. It took me way too long to figure this out, that she experiences love through touch. I don't experience it that way, so I don't default to it in the way that she would need me to. And so when she would come home and be frustrated and want to vent or talk about something, I would be trying to fix it. I'd be trying to solve it, answer the question, whatever, give advice. When what she really needed was just a hug. She wanted me to listen and then just give her a hug. And similarly, I experience love as through acts of service. And so for her to give love to me in the way that I need, it's through that. But that understanding, developing an awareness of what those languages are in your relationship makes a big difference. The other one is avoiding the traps. It's avoiding the downside. Dr. John Gottman has done a ton of research and work on the main traps that lead to divorce. They were able to predict divorce at like a 90+%, some incredible rate from just observing conversations. And I share them in the book, some of these things that people need to avoid. Contempt is probably the single worst one that they kind of view as like the relationship killer, identifying contempt. And just having an awareness of these places where you are going to die. Like Charlie Munger says, all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. Rest in peace, obviously, because he sadly did find that. He sadly found that place. Right? Exactly. No matter how much money you have, unfortunately. Although his legacy lives on for sure. Absolutely. That awareness, though, of those challenges that you can run into in a relationship and learning to avoid them, learning the communication styles to avoid them, very, very important.
And I think avoiding those traps, it's a big sort of theme in your book, too, because you don't just talk about goals. You talk about anti-goals in all of the different areas. Just expand upon that a little bit.
Yeah, the idea of anti-goals is a powerful one. So you know what goals are. You're setting the direction where you're trying to go, what you're trying to achieve. Anti-goals are what you're trying to avoid on the path to achieving those goals. So imagine yourself climbing a mountain. My goal is to get to the summit of the mountain. My anti-goal might be dying in getting to the summit, right? Like people go to Mount Everest, you get to the top, but you die on the way back down. That wasn't a very successful climb. You got to the summit, but you died, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, or like, hey, I don't want to lose, I don't want to lose my toes when I get to the summit. And so the example for your life is you might want to become the CEO of your company, but the anti-goal could be 300 days away from my family every single year. It might be losing my health because I'm on planes all the time, eating crap, drinking all the time. There are these things that you need to avoid while you are achieving your goals. And they're just as important. Because what I write about in the book is this idea of the Pyrrhic victory. It's this idea of a victory that comes at such a steep cost that it might as well have been a defeat. And so many of us experience those in our lives. We achieve the thing that we set out to achieve, but at what cost to the other areas of our life?
No, it's definitely something we have to be super conscious of. And for those that don't know the story of Pyrrhus, can you just kind of run that down?
Yeah, so King Pyrrhus of Epirus, an ancient king of kind of a small kingdom, he was sort of waging a bunch of inconsequential battles when he got called to help support a small city-state against an invading Roman Empire at the time. And realizing that the enemy of his enemy was his friend, he decided to go and support this small city-state, which was named Tarentum. And he sails over there and wages this battle against the Romans, wins the battle, but at an enormous cost to his army, loses a bunch of his senior generals, loses thousands and thousands of his men in the battle. And he's said to have remarked, "Another such victory and we will be undone." So if we have another victory like that, quote unquote, we're going to be done.
Yeah.
Ends up having to sail back to his kingdom where he wages a few more battles and then ends up dying in sort of anonymity. Fortunately for him, his name did live on, and it's Pyrrhus, the Pyrrhic victory, is now how we refer to a victory that comes at such a steep cost that it might as well have been a defeat. We see that in our own lives. And frankly, it was what was happening and what I was marching towards if I hadn't made a change. I was making more and more money. I was going to achieve that victory. But while I was on that journey, my health was suffering. My relationship with my wife was starting to suffer and fall apart. My relationship with my parents was non-existent. With my sister was the worst it had ever been. All of these other areas of my life were crumbling while I was achieving this victory. So the Pyrrhic victory was what I was headed towards. And I think for a lot of people, it is the end state of what they are headed towards if they don't make a change, if they don't actually reverse course or change course.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely crucial. And
Lao Tzu said, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're headed.
That's a great word of caution. And we'll just kind of roll it back. Where we're headed is really important. That's a big theme in the book, trying to get wealth in all of these really important areas of our lives. But let's roll it back to the beginning, because when you talk about mental wealth, which is another big section, and obviously you write the newsletter called The Curiosity Chronicle. I love this section where you talk about how curiosity is the foundation of a life of mental wealth. And in fact, you call it the manufacturer's default setting. And when we're kids, when we're children, we pursue everything, as you say, with this wide-eyed awe. And it's the real fountain of youth. And how can we recapture that?
It's finding those things that spark your curiosity and allowing yourself the space to pursue them and to go down those rabbit holes. It's avoiding this temptation to only pursue things that you feel have a utility to your life, quote unquote. As you get older, you start narrowing the aperture of your life and curiosity. You start only focusing on the things that are going to make you money or that are going to, drive some financial outcome in your life, when in reality, curiosity pursued is an end in and of itself. I tell the story of this family friend, Hank.
Hank.
Who is an amazing, remarkable person. And the thing that makes him so remarkable is he's 99 years old and he still pursues his curiosity like my son at 2.5.
That's awesome.
And there's a reason he's 99 and still in good mental health. There's a reason he still does the New York Times crossword, that he still, engages, reads the news, is interested in things that are happening in the world. His body is starting to fall apart, but his mind is so sharp and there. And it's no secret scientifically that engaging your mind on a daily basis keeps you young. It actually keeps your mind sharp and strong. And we can all do that. It's a free pill, right? Like if you could bottle up curiosity in a pill, all of the pharmaceutical companies in the world would be clamoring to sell it to you at some enormous markup, unfortunately. But you can have it for free if you just give yourself the space to pursue those things that grab your excitement.
Yeah, and I think it's really, really important to learn for knowledge's sake, to just listen to music because you love it, because it touches your soul. It's really interesting that St. Thomas Aquinas said that, like, the reason why anybody, I'm kind of paraphrasing him here, but he basically said, the angelic doctor, he said, the reason why anybody does anything is because they think it's going to make them happy. Even like rank sinners and criminals, they think that what they're doing is going to make them happy. They're wrong about that, but and you talk in the book about a Buddhist monk who was pretty successful in North America, goes to, I believe it was India, and he's the happiest guy in the world. Talk to me about him.
Yeah, they slapped like 250 electrodes on his body to watch him and observe him meditating, and the sort of joke is that he's the happiest man alive because he had this level of activation in his brain that they had never seen before. And one of the points I try to get across in the book is you don't need to meditate for 12 hours a day to achieve this state, to achieve these states of happiness, to achieve these states of presence. It's really about just creating space in your life. Yeah. And that concept of space is really important. It's this idea that you're constantly being hit by stimulus in your life. We're all used to that. Stimulus is like anything, the inputs, the emails, the questions, the responsibilities, all of these things constantly. And you're forced into this world where it's a stimulus into an immediate response. Now, Viktor Frankl talks about how our power in life is in the space that we can create between stimulus and response, because in that space is our ability to choose. It's our ability to choose how we are going to respond to all these things rather than just defaulting into the fastest one we can find. And that space is entirely up to you to create. And it's entirely up to you how to create it. Now, some people will create it through meditation for many hours a day. Yeah. I will not. Some people will create it through religious practice, through prayer is a beautiful way of creating space, through walks in nature, through milling around in the garden, through just sitting quietly in a room, staring around. But the important point is that you find these rituals that do create that space in your life, because they enhance your mental health for sure, but they also give you an enhanced ability to actually deal with those stimulus points that come in.
Yeah, I love that. And it has to be appropriate to where we are in life, our age, our state in life, our duties in life. Like most of us are living in the middle of the world. We're not in a monastery. And that's okay, because we can still experience those things. And I was going to ask you about this, because you obviously have read a lot about, especially when you were searching, you talk about in the book how you read a lot of spiritual tomes as well and did some searching there. Did you ever think about making spirituality one of the types of wealth in the book, or is that just like you want to be like kind of more general than that? Because it kind of is sprinkled throughout a little bit.
It is sprinkled throughout intentionally, because I think that spirituality runs the gamut of many of these, and its involvement across these, especially in that context of space, is a very important one. And my personal perspective is that I want people to be able to engage with these concepts wherever they are in their life. And if you have a real spiritual connection, if you have a spiritual practice, meditation, the community around it, that is deeply involved in these different types of wealth. Yeah, I mean, if you are very connected to your church, for example, there's an enormous social wealth component to that. Yeah. The community within religion is one of the most powerful things that has allowed religion to persist for as long as it has and to create so much value for people in their lives. It's also an enormous part of creating that space in your life, because that space can be a connection to God. It can be a connection to some higher power, whoever yours may be. So my view as I kind of wrestled with these concepts was that spiritual wealth really does connect through all of these different ideas. I mean, physical wealth, frankly, the ability to connect with your body is another form of connection with God for many people. And so I found in my own wrestling with it was just that idea that spiritual wealth really does connect across all of these.
Yeah, that's a good segue, because one of the works that I just kind of blew my mind over the last few years, and it's become kind of a thing, is this thing called The Theology of the Body. It was written by the late St. John Paul II, The Theology of the Human Body. Because I think a lot of people think that, there's an old hymn, all fly away. It's like the body is this prison that we have to break out of. And, the real life is elsewhere, in the clouds. No. God created us as embodied persons, a unity of body and soul. And this is the Jewish concept of shalom, a total wellness. And so the physical is certainly a part of that. I will say this. I have some work to do in that area.
We all do.
But you're a little bit ahead of me there. And I saw that you posted that you were hanging out with Huberman, maybe out in California somewhere. Huberman obviously has got He's pretty buff. He's got the Huberman protocols. What are the Bloom protocols for physical wealth?
I try to keep things simple, and it comes across in the book, hopefully. But I really think that physical wealth and your connection to your body comes down to 3 pillars: movement, nutrition, and recovery. And the way I frame this up in the book and in my own life is just that all of this is sort of a video game. And the best way to think about your physical wealth is using a video game analogy, which is you start at level 1. And when you're at level 1, you don't need to worry about level 100 or level 5 for that matter. You just need to worry about level 1 and completing whatever the quests are, whatever the tasks are at level 1. One of the biggest issues, in my view, with all of these different fads within the physical wealth domain is that they encourage you to operate at level 72 when you are at level 1.
That's a great point.
And that is just intimidating, right?
Yeah.
You would never do that in another area of your life. You wouldn't, sit down and worry about, getting into Harvard when you're, in second grade learning to read. Maybe some people would, and that's a big issue too. And that's usually parents. The kids would not worry about that.
Point. The kids,
the helicopter parents might. But the point is, nail the boring basics. Then you can think about what the next level is.
Yeah.
And in the book, I talk about what I think those boring basics are for each of those levels. And the point is that they aren't very hard. But when you're barraged by the level 100, you default to thinking, oh my God, too intimidating. So you do nothing.
Yeah.
And ambitious people in particular allow that kind of optimal to get in the way of beneficial.
Yeah.
You can start making progress on your physical wealth journey by going for a 30-minute walk every single day. You don't have to go to the gym. You don't have to, go for a sprint or run or do some like hour-long class, CrossFit, whatever. You just go for a 30-minute walk. Yeah. If you're starting out, do that every single day for a month. I guarantee you will feel different, mentally and physically, by the way. And so that is really what I try to get at in the book is like, nail these boring basics before you worry about Andrew's, 100 protocols or Peter Attia's protocols. They're fantastic. And I think the way that they've expanded the kind of Overton window around what health looks like is very important. But just start small and build from there.
Yeah, I love it. And your book gives so many actionable ways to do just that. And talking about walks too, I mean, I concur with that. I probably weigh about 25 or 50 pounds more if I hadn't got a large dog that needs to be walked at least 2 hours a day pretty much. So, and I do a lot of my thinking on walks. I do a lot of prayer on walks. And I know you talk about that too as something you can do to really start thinking differently. Is taking a walk. Steve Jobs, he comes up in the book a lot. He used to do this all the time with people. He used to just, hey, let's go for a walk. And that they would just like hours. He would be out with like executives at Apple hashing out stuff, and maybe guys like your friend Tim Cook.
Yeah. There is there's significant scientific research now supporting the idea that walks are a game-changing intervention in your life. And they also happen to be lovely in terms of how they make you feel, especially being out in nature. Stanford did a study that showed that walks increased creative thinking by 60-70%.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
That's
and
huge.
you feel that. If you're in the creative field, or even if you need to find creative solutions to a problem in your relationships or life or work, going for a walk is a free way to enhance your creative thinking. I personally find that if I don't walk on a given day, I feel way different at the end of the day. And so I take every chance I can. Even if it's just a 5-minute walk between meetings or a 15-minute walk after lunch, improves your digestion, you feel less sleepy in the afternoon. All of these things really help. And if you can pair it with time with your partner, time with your kid. The amount of walking my wife and I have done with our son since he was born, it's like it's a dramatic positive impact on our connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is another area in which we can become surprisingly wealthy, with not a whole lot of crazy effort up front. So let's just close off now, because with the last thing, which is of course financial wealth, we don't want to ignore that as well. It's interesting to me too. Like whenever money is a spiritual thing too. It's a resource that we've been entrusted with. And when you read through the New Testament, Jesus talked a lot about money. He talked about two things really more than anything else. It was like hell and how to avoid it, and also money. Maybe the two are connected. Maybe the two are connected. How we use resources like that, time, talent, treasure, does really kind of have ripples, Again, the Roman Empire, as Maximus says, what we do in life echoes in eternity. And I don't know if Gladiator 2 is going to be as good, but what do you think the financial warrior needs to do to get winning in those battles?
I think the most important thing with financial wealth, which is really the angle I take and should come across in the book, is that expectations are your greatest financial liability. If your expectations rise faster than your assets, you will never be wealthy. You will never be rich, because you'll constantly be chasing some definition of more that's just floating out in front of you. And the challenge with that is it's a mirage. You get it, and then you just reset to the next level.
Yeah.
I talk about this study in the book that Michael Norton at Harvard Business School did, where he asked a group of multimillionaires, people from several $1 million up to $100+ million, how happy they were. And they answered on a scale of 1 to 10. Then he asked them how much money they would have to have in order to be at a 10. And across the board, whether they had $1 million or $100 million, they said somewhere between 2 to 3 times as much as they currently have.
Oh, wow.
Which makes no sense, right?
Exactly,
like at some point, it should be a cap.
Yeah.
But it's the reality of how humans operate.
Yep.
We just reset. And so if you're constantly chasing, if you never define what enough looks like to you, you're going to be perpetually unhappy. You're never going to build that enough life, as I talk about it in the book. Following the simple playbooks that are laid out around actually building and compounding financial wealth is the pathway to get there, but you need to develop a clear awareness of what enough looks like for you. That doesn't mean that it has to be Spartan. Your enough life can involve a vacation home. It can involve several vacations a year, but defining it clearly and rationally forces it into your conscious mind, which means that it's not as easy to allow it to just continue to build and accelerate. It probably still will to some extent, but forcing it to be a conscious change rather than a subconscious one is an important shift.
Yeah, that is an important shift. And there's so many shifts that I made when I was reading the book. It's just so packed with not only information, but it is actionable. And I really do appreciate the fact that you gave people tools in the book for each of those areas to truly have this holistic shalom, if you will, hopefully, of all kinds of different wealth in our lives. So let me ask you a couple questions. Number one, how can people connect with you, Sahil?
I am at Sahil Bloom on every major platform. It's one of the benefits of having a weird name is that people can find you pretty easily. And website is sahilbloom.com.
And how can people get the book and find out more about it?
The book should be available everywhere books are sold. Your local bookstores, always appreciated to support your local bookstores wherever you might find them. And then obviously on Amazon, you can find more information about the book at the5typesofwealth.com. There's also added resources so that you can go deeper on some of the topics.
Love it. Well, thank you for writing it. I'm sure it's the first of many. And thank you for taking the time. Sahil
Thank
Bloom,
you.
it's great to run you down. Appreciate you.
Thanks so much.